I want to introduce David Young. Lots of you know him from his long time here, but he's an associate professor in the Department of Economics at, this university back on the East Coast. I forget what it's called, at Harvard. He's a faculty research fellow at NBR. He's a global scholar at CFAIR. And I think if you don't know him personally, you know his research. It focuses on political economy, behavioral and experimental economics, econ history, culture economics. And he focuses on sort of the stability and forces of change in authoritarian regimes. And most of the people in this room know about these regimes, drawing lessons from both history and contemporary China. He got his BA in statistics. Can we listen? He got his BA in statistics and BS in business administration from a school across the bay, actually the same school that I got my degree from. So he's my Shudi, so from Berkeley. And then he came across the bay, made a good decision, got his PhD in economics from Stanford about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years, 4 years ago. And he's just recently promoted to associate professor. So David, it's all you. So
awesome. Thank you so much for having me. It's always great to be back, and certainly first time being back since COVID, and very excited to present this paper as well. In fact, I'm going to do 2 papers together, broadly under the same topic, AI-tocracy. Hopefully, the title will become a bit more clear. So this is the title is the part of the paper of promised, and will become clear exactly what we mean by that. It's joint work with Martin Baraha at MIT, Andrew Kao student at Harvard, and Noam Hickman, many of you know from Paris. So the broad question that we're interested in answering in this paper or this set of papers is to understand, can one sustain frontier innovation under autocratic regimes? This is a question that political economists has been thinking about for decades. And the conventional wisdom emerging from different parts of the field has been under the consensus that the frontier innovation is fundamentally misaligned with non-democratic regimes. The explanation could vary. It could come in the format of, because the regime lacked credible commitment, hence it might deter innovators or entrepreneurs from making sufficient investments, hence there's not going to be sufficient frontier innovation. It could also come in the form of ex post expropriation, that sort of the innovation that would have been needed to be there might have been already being expropriated again without the credible commitment. Okay. Now, what we want to ask in this paper and also in the second part of this paper, this agenda is to try to demonstrate and hopefully convince you sort of empirically that one could observe frontier innovation being developed and sustained under a non-democratic regimes. And in particular, when frontier innovation and non-democratic regimes are mutually reinforcing and each other, it could generate sort of this new equilibrium. This is not to suggest that every single frontier innovation would be satisfied with this mutually reinforcing relationship, but there might exist such frontier innovation and such regime. Okay. In particular, 2 conditions need to be satisfied for such mutually reinforcing relationship to exist. First is that the innovative output needs to be sort of supportive of the regime stability. One could imagine many sort of technologies, such as sort of the radio stations, such as the early sort of version of the internet, is fundamentally sort of destabilizing to the regime. But there could exist frontier innovation, and the output itself it actually would increase the autocrat's probability of maintaining power. That itself is not going to generate this self-reinforcing regime. So you need sort of second criteria or second conditions to be satisfied as well, which is when autocrats put investments to try to acquire and try to develop certain technology, the autocrat's demand and autocrat's ability to provide certain key inputs to the sector would generate much broader spillover of the technology in both the government and also in the commercial sector. And that broad spillover to the commercial sector is going to be key to think about sort of the direction of innovation and how healthy and how broad the frontier innovation frontier is being pushed. Okay. Now, recent sort of social science scholars have sort of speculated that artificial intelligence might satisfy these two conditions. That might be a very different kind of frontier innovation that might generate this self-sustaining relationship with mutually reinforcing relationship with the autocrats. Many people, such as Rubov and some more recent work, such as Tyrrell in 2021, suggest that artificial intelligence is fundamentally a technology that's increased ability for someone, decision maker, to make predictions. And be able to make predictions about human behavior is a fundamental input for state surveillance and political control. So in that regard, there could exist a very strong alignment between the usage of this technology and the goal of the technology from a get-go to the objective that the autocratic regimes and its political control motives might desire. Some of our own earlier work also suggests that to the extent that AI is different from other technology in the sense of not only does it require a lot of inputs of human capital and physical capital, AI also is a very data-intensive sector that requires data as an input. And throughout history, government is the key collector and repositories of a large amount of data, simply just to be able to operate and to provide key government functions. And to the extent that government data might then be shared to the firms who conduct AI innovation, this can generate a lot of spillovers where a key input being supplied to the sector, and the innovators could use the data for multiple purposes that can start to generate the kind of commercial spillover that one might expect. Okay. I should say that these two speculations are very much speculated, but has not been rigorously empirically tested. And very much of what we want to do in this paper is try to empirically, hopefully convince you that there is a causal chain that can link these two.
So I have a quick question. Does this have to be in a marketized autocratic regime that you're talking about? Because it seems like you're saying that all of the innovation is done by commercial firms.
Yeah.
So we can't have a Soviet Union economy where we have the state-owned firms that are a part of the hierarchy, and the research staff is in there, and they just get fed down capital, and they do the innovation. So can that happen, or is it because they aren't motivated enough that they aren't going to come up with frontier technologies? How does so this applies to China, not to the former Soviet Union?
Right. So that's a good question. So I'm not going to be able to have too much to say about how much of the innovation is happening. What is counterfactual if the entire AI sector is state-owned? That's the counterfactual we're not going to have. I'm going to show you that a particular link in this environment is that AI sector need not be a private sector. It could be government sector, a government owned AI sector. It provides an output that government has strong demand on, so it could procure those products. And that procurement generates the linkage between the government, its data, and the firm. Okay, so the ownership structure there is not going to be first order important per se. So that's the thing that most concrete we can say. I'm going to broadly discuss about if you think about this mutual reinforcing relationship, you can see some flavor of such mutual relationships exist in other settings. The aerospace sector in Soviet it has different the sector has a different way of sustaining the regime back then. You can think about the chemical engineering sector in Imperial Germany as a similar flavor of that's a sector that the regime really draw prestige on, and that's a sector that generates this mutual. So let me be more concrete about exactly what we hope to achieve in this paper. So there are two parts, and it corresponds to the two paper that I'm going to present. The first one is that I'm going to test for a mutual reinforcing relationship between the frontier innovation and the autocratic regimes in the context of China's facial recognition AI sector. So I should be very clear that this is meant to be a showing existence result. It's not meant to be showing that such relationship will exist in a more uniform, universal and general form. This is that in one of probably the most important sector moving forward in the next decade or so, and in one of the most important countries in terms of the political and economic development, we potentially see such mutually reinforcing relationship. Okay. And more concretely, I'm going to show you three empirical relationships, and hopefully each of the links I can convince you that's causal. I'm going to show you that when local regions in China face pressure for political instability, meaning protests and local unrest, that leads to local government to start procure for AI, public security AI product. Okay, so there's a political motivated demand for this particular high technology. Okay. I'm also then going to show you that the procurement of those AI products actually helps the regime to remain stable. After the local government buys more public security AI, it leads to a sort of a suppression of subsequent protests in a single country. So it generates sort of the political premium from local government's perspective. Okay, so that's on the political side of the mutually enforcing relationship. And then the third one I'm going to show you is that for the local AI firms, not local AI firms, this firm doesn't need to be located in the same region, but the AI firms who provide those products to the local governments, I'm going to show you that those AI firms receive government data, receive street camera data, and so on, and then the AI firms are allowed to use those data and use those additional input to start innovating, not only on the government front, but also innovate on the commercial front. So to give you a flavor of some of the commercial applications of this, and I think this highlights sort of the economists will call the return to scope of data, because you can use data simultaneously for multiple purposes without thinking about sort of crowding out decisions. Because if you think about engineers, you have to decide whether to allocate engineer to one task versus the other, and that generates allocation decision. But for data, if that's a key input, I can simultaneously use data for multiple purposes without thinking about marginal profit, and that will be important to think about overall direction innovation. So here's one example of a commercial application of facial recognition platform. What this demo is showing, this is a demo from one of the large AI companies. What it's showing is a product that tracks consumers in the retail space. And it's important that sort of in very non-trivial from a technological perspective is that the blue sort of tags of the individual are, in addition to sort of figuring out the age, sort of the other sort of basic demographics of the individual, the blue label of those spaces indicate that this person has come to the store before. This is repeated customer, and hence you might be able to link it to all the previous purchase behaviorals, and then the other sort of dots are able to differentiate whether this is a first-time consumer. This is going to be very important from a retail perspective to think about sort of individual targeted advertising and so on, which will have a lot of commercial value. Okay, this is just one example of the commercial application. Okay. So that's the first part of the paper.
So that company exists in China today?
And this product exists for real as well.
And stores buy it? Yes.
Yeah. You can imagine this how I mean, essentially you can think about Amazon Go store is try to do this in-house, and here's a platform that even small sort of retailers can purchase and start. Okay, so that's the first part. Hopefully, I will be able to. I will walk you very slowly, and hopefully to convince you that each of these arrows here, we can demonstrate that sort of empirically and from established causal. Okay. The second part, for the last sort of maybe 15 minutes of the talk, I'm going to talk about sort of the next step of this part to think about. If China has a political motivated demand for the AI product, and then sort of the government demand for AI product generates further innovation, and not only in the commercial government sector, but also in the commercial sector, the natural question would be, countries such as China would have a comparative advantage in artificial intelligence, and one would be able to see potential international ramification of this to trade and to sort of potential different direction of trade. And I'm going to talk about sort of some of the more recent work we have done about tracking the global trade in AI and try to back out of China's comparative advantage and the international ramification of China's AI leadership. Okay. Yes.
So do you think that, is it fair to say that facial recognition equals AI?
No.
I mean, AI is very broad.
Yeah.
Facial recognition benefits from lots of data,
yeah,
but there's other inputs to AI, right? So how much is this going to be representative of AI writ large, or is it some of those other inputs?
Yeah. So if I refer to your question, I think you're asking, within AI, facial recognition is one sector or one subject of AI. There's sort of object recognition, which essentially was behind the autonomous vehicles. That's another branch of AI. Medical applications of AI, again, use object recognition, voice recognition, all those sub branches of AI. Everything here I'm showing you today is about facial recognition, because I'm not going to have much to say beyond facial recognition per se. Again, as a proof of concept that such recognition could exist. Now, there are two important things though to distinguish. One is that we have to keep in mind, among all the current development in AI, facial recognition is the one that has the most mature commercial application. So you could imagine that, while it need not come through this particular form of linkage with the government, the next step for voice recognition could follow very similar paths. But I don't have anything concrete to say empirically. The second one is that you can start asking within the AI, is there distortion between there too much facial recognition versus too little medical applications of AI due to the government? That's something that we're currently working on, but I have nothing to report today. So think about sort of the direction of innovation, the distortion of innovation direction within the broader AI sector. Yes.
To follow up on that, are you saying the facial recognitions are both very frontier technology and also applicable, customizable to clients' products? Both, right?
Yes. Yeah. And that I think I would say this is a general statement for many AI. It's just that many other parts of the AI are a couple of years lag behind facial recognition. Medical app AI is really booming, and it's getting its way into the commercial side. The voice recognition is again that's so I think all the AI sector is dual. So I'm going to come back to this in the end. Sort of, one way to think about a lot of the AI is in the older sort of political science and political economy literature. Think about them as dual purpose technology, and AI has that feature of this technology that has a a non-civilian use, and it has a commercial / civilian purposes. All right, so that's the roadmap for today. I want to spend a couple of minutes to describe sort of the data sources we use for this project. For several of these data sources, we build them from scratch, and there's all from sort of public available data sources. And it's our hope that sort of after this set of papers, we'll be able to make these data sources publicly available for other students. Okay. So to answer sort of the question I just described, or sort of the roadmap, we need, broadly speaking, 4 different sets of data. I'm going to describe them one at a time. Okay. So first data sets that we need to reconstruct is a data set that allows to link AI firms with the government, and in particular link AI firms with their business and sort of procurement interaction with the local government. So this data set actually merged 2 data sets together. The first one is that we constructed, I think, fairly comprehensively the entire roster of all the facial recognition AI firms in China. There are about 8,000 AI firms that ever existed in the space. We combine sort of 2 company resources, K and Cha, which is the China-based source, and PitchBook, which is the US-based source. Okay. Second, we link this to the universe of government procurement contracts. There are 3 million such contracts in the last decade. Large, sort of majority of them are contracts coming from the local governments. And this is coming from an official source, the government procurement database maintained by the Ministry of Finance. The data source is public because it's meant to sort of curb corruption in the procurement space. Okay, so that's a sort of a example of each of the procurement contracts, and then we link them together. Okay, so we link each individual local government buyer to the AI firms among the 8,000 AI firms who were in our roster. Our assumption is that if a local government is buying stuff from a facial recognition AI firm, it's not buying sort of chairs or desks, it's buying AI services. Okay. I'm going to primarily focus on about 10,000 AI contracts issued by local public security arms of the government. So these are local police departments, local public security arms and units of the government as our primary sort of base of analysis. And I'm going to sort of occasionally draw in non-public security arms of the government's purchase of AI, such as local schools, local hospital purchase of AI, as in some cases perceived. Okay. This procurement database is also going to allow us to look at all the complementary technologies, such as local governments buying cameras, which is needed to support AI technology, high resolution cameras, and so on. So I'm going to draw those data sets in as well. Okay. So that's on the firms and government side. This database gives us for each individual firms and each individual local governments a precise timing and a precise sort of interaction at what point there's a procurement, and potentially at what point is there service delivery and potentially a flow of data to it.
So do you have you must have like ownership, but do you know investment in those 7,000 firms? Do we know if they have foreign links? Do we know where they're, I mean, it seems to me that things that are, that could simultaneously affect this government to procurement contract maybe reflecting other inputs.
Yes,
uh,
yes,
and-
yeah. No, that's a good question. So we have investments. We also have for a large fraction of the procurement, we also know the actual monetary term. So we know sort of the literally revenue that's being injected to the government. So two things on that, and just to be clear, one is that I'm not going to be able to, in the baseline version, I'm not going to be able to what was not our intention. We're going to say that what's the overall effects of having a government contracts, money will be injected, government ties might be injected, and data might be injected. I'm going to estimate the overall effects. Okay, I'm going to also estimate, so hopefully, sort of, at some margin, the marginal effects of data, but we're going to think about this as a package of things that pass on to the firm by winning a procurement contract. Now, from the capital sort of injection side, in fact, these firms we observed that for the contracts that actually are more data rich, meaning the local jurisdiction have more cameras on the street already, so hence a richer flow of data coming in. Those contracts tend to be slightly lower price because there are more bidders to the contract. So if anything, sort of think about when a data rich contract will come with smaller capital, because the firm probably understand that capital is not a binding constraint in this environment, but the data oftentimes is. So I'm going to talk about that. The second data set, many of you might be familiar in this audience already, which is linking sort of the each local governments and in the entire period also to the pension sort of political pressure. We're going to use GDELT as our baseline, but our results are actually very similar if we use some alternative source. GDELT is a global data set that tracks sort of different political, not necessarily political, but all sorts of events around the world. We're going to focus on the China portion of this database, and then focus on the political unrest that ranges from political protests, political demands, and threats and strikes. Okay, so overall, this is going to give us about 10,000 local unrests from 2014 to 2020 throughout the entire country. Okay, so some of the ones that we read on the news, for example, what prominently featured in the database, the Shanghai residents protest for before, not in the last month, protest against property, proposing of property rights, the property tax law and so on. So these are the sort of the local government's political environment that we're going to measure. Okay. The third database that we need to construct is that we need to, on the economic side, we need to see what the firms are producing. Okay. So that turned out to be a somewhat challenging because the vast majority of these AI firms are not public listed firms. So there's no sort of routine demand for those firms to release records of their product development and so on. However, what makes our life slightly easier is that given these are mostly software firms, in China, the software developer needs to register the software with the government's Ministry of Industry and Information Technology before the software can be released to the clients. Okay. So we get the entire registry from Ministry of Industry and Information Technology, and then link each of the new software that's being submitted to the registration over the last decade back to the 8,000 AI firms. Okay. We're not going to do the cross-validate this database just because most of these firms, again, vast majority of the firms, except for one, are public listed. But there is one firm that is public listed, the MACB, which is the largest AI facial recognition AI firms in one of the largest in the world, and the first with the IPO process. So for the MACB, we can take the company's own IPO prospectus and see what are the software that MACB themselves released. And then we see sort of 100% of the MACB's own software release from the IPO prospectus in the Ministry of Industry and Technology's registration.
Why does the ministry make that public? It's public, I
It's
assume.
public. Yeah. Well, you can ask the question to many parts of the Chinese government, why certain records are publicly listed.
I mean, I get the procurement is from basically making it public, and you can see. Wow.
I mean, I think behind it, I think it's a similar infrastructure of the patent office. But I think your point about looking is that patents, there's institutional reasons and economic incentive reasons why it needs to be public, but these need not be the case. Okay. And in economic term, these are not sort of innovation in the sense of new patents and so on, but these are going to be what economists will call product innovation. New products being developed, new software releases, major upgrades of software, and so on.
Yeah, Holbein has a question, and he wants to know, how is this different from the USSR making the atomic bomb in 1949?
There are some similarity to that. I'm going to come back to some of this towards the end of the talk. One important feature of thinking about weapon development, and you're going to see some similarities, some differences, is that regardless of whether you're an autocrat or a democrat regime, every government would prefer to have atomic bombs. So it's not necessarily going to be it's a very potentially a first order autocratic bias in the technology. Every weaponry, is all about competition, and every government wants. So what makes AI particularly special and makes aerospace sort of technology particularly special in the Soviet case is that this is technology that on top of the competition, it draws sort of the domestic political demands that democratic governments may not necessarily have. But that's a good question. I'm going to come back to this. Okay. So the software, we're going to do a couple more things with it to think about sort of the economic spillover of that. A big part of this is because it's not only important, sort of sufficient for us to just look at the total software production, but we want to ideally be able to say whether the new software is being made for the government or made for the commercial sector. Okay? Because the commercial sector spillover in direction, that's going to be crucial to think about the general direction of the industry. So we're going to be able to tell apart whether the software is intended for government and commercial by looking at the software description. For example, a software that the images that show you a customer tracing system in the retail space. So this is the real name of the software developed by an AI firm. We're going to call that software a commercial software. A traffic control system software, we're going to call that a government software. Okay? So we're not going to be able to do this by hand, but we'll use a machine learning algorithm to categorize this after a sort of manually labeled about 13,000 these softwares. We're also going to be able to tell a bit about whether each of the new AI software has an explicit surveillance component in it. For example, a software that's meant to help the parents track the children in the city. When it's in its description, it's going to have a lot of flavors of tracking and surveillance, and we're going to be able to say, are those firms who get data from local governments are starting to produce more things that are surveillance heavy.
Of course, one interpretation of this data is innovation, but another interpretation is just the firm's effort to try to secure more money from the government.
Yeah, which is crucial for us to think about, because Econ 101 will tell you if you get a new contract that generates 1/3 of the firm's revenue, you're probably going to reallocate a lot of the intermediate input to your best engineers, your best sort of other hardware and intermediate output to produce things for the government to secure subsequent contracts. That's going to generate a crowd out of commercial software innovation because the resources is going to be start to shift more towards the government sector. Okay. Now here I'm going to show you that when you have a big sort of government contracts come in, the firms are simultaneously and anything more start to produce more from the commercial sector, and the crowding into the commercial sector, which is the part that makes this a special kind.
Yeah, I don't object to that, but what I'm wondering is whether you can categorize this as innovation. These firms may be just downloading from GitHub, making sort of customization for the government, and then register at administrative.
Right. So that's a great question. So there are two things that we can show you that this is actually innovation at the frontier. One is that regularly, and in the last 2 years not anymore, but the U.S. government actually runs this global facial recognition vendor test, which is considered as the most authoritative sort of ranking of the quality of the product of facial recognition algorithms. Every year, there's a competition of how accurate and how fast the facial recognition algorithms are. This is the most recent version. You see the top sort of algorithms. Not sort of necessarily the top place holders are from the countries that were associated with frontier. China is very dominating in the top 10. And these are sort of E2 and SenseTime, for example, are some of you might be familiar with. These are the largest facial recognition efforts. So these are literally the highest quality AI algorithms. Now, the second point, which I'm going to come back to when I start thinking about trade, is that one way the economists sort of infer whether a product is at the frontier is that if the company's product is being traded globally, that's going to be sort of that's going to be an indicator of that the product is in some margin at the frontier, and hence it has a global edge that other people demanded. Okay, so I'm going to use these two as what is about. These are the product really at the frontier, and many of them are the firms and products in our database. We see these E2 and system products in our database. Okay. Any other questions on that? All right. So the last database that we build is a database on the global trade in facial recognition AI. service trade is notoriously hard to be recorded in the standard trade data sets, and AI certainly was not even included in some of the types of the service trade collection. Okay, so we want to build something from scratch. Now, our database covers, I think, pretty comprehensively the international procurement of AI tech, especially by the governments. We want to build on some amazing work done by folks in the Carnegie Endowment Fund. And we're going to take their reports and then trace back to each of the companies and each of the companies' own releases to build a comprehensive data set. Okay, and that also involves us to go back to each of the firms who we think would have been exported and see the firm's press releases. Does it indicate any activity of the product being sold to a non-domestic buyer? Okay. We're gonna hand code the exporting, the importing country, the years of the deal, the firms, and whether the product itself involves some flavor of civilian smart city product platforms, and so on. And some of the high-profile ones, again, that we see it in the database. For example, Huawei's export of the Safe City service to Laos. Bosch sort of equipped the Hong Kong-Zhuhai-Macau bridge with the security solutions in the AI platform. So these are the sort of AI, the trade deals that we observe. Overall, we observe over the last 5 years where AI trade really started to become so prevalent. About 1,400 AI trade deals coming from 37 exporting countries and 132 importing countries. This is going to be the base of when I start thinking about international ramification of China's AI development. As a benchmark, we're also going to use all the trade from other frontier technology in biotech, in clean energy, in nuclear energy, nuclear technology, and so on as a benchmark. Is AI quite different from all the other frontier technology in terms of the trade patterns, or is it just another frontier technology? Right? Any questions so far about the data sets? And
what's the key of this technology? Is it data, software, hardware, something else? Does it rely on US technology, or would I ask you of US human capital?
I don't have much to say besides that. I think it's at the high level. It's safe to assume that the conventional input into the development capital and human capital is still very relevant in the AI space. And on top of that, the data is a third input that many other frontier technology may not share. Now the question is about. And you can ask the question in all three of the inputs, data, human capital, and capital, how much linkage is of that to the American or non-China resources? I don't have much to say from our data sets at all. I'm, however, going to compare China's AI exports and the scale of China's AI exports compared to the US AI exports to indirectly think about sort of where China stands in terms of US development in the sector, but I don't have much to say about the linkages between those countries.
Yeah, and so go to the previous slide.
Yeah.
I was just going to ask you, you're going to talk about this. So of these 37 export countries, are 2 of them the US and China? And you're going to, 2 of the exporting countries.
Yes.
Yeah, and so you're going to tell us the comparison of those.
Yes. Yeah, that's going to come. China's. Yeah, I don't want to spill the
Okay.
China and US are important. Surprise. Okay. All right. So that's the data sets that we built for this set of projects. I'm going to now start to show you the results. Because each of the questions involve a bit of the different empirical strategies, the way I'm going to present this is that for each of the results, I'm going to describe the empirical strategy, identification strategy, essentially, and because they're all slightly different in the structure. And then I'm going to show you the results. Okay. The first set of results I'm going to show you is the political side of mission reinforcement, which is does AI and autocrats does AI facial recognition actually enhance autocrats political control? And for those, I'm going to show 2 relationships. One is that there's a political motivated demand for AI. When unrest happens, the local government buys more AI, and the additional AI investment the local government puts in the local jurisdiction actually helps that it makes the future unrest less likely to happen. Okay, so those are the two goals. Now the first one. Our sort of more concretely, our empirical question is going to be fairly straightforward, which is do episodes of local unrest in one quarter in one particular prefecture. Prefecture and quarter is our unit analysis, but quarter doesn't quite matter. We can change the time frame. Everything's very similar. Does episodes of local unrest in one quarter in one prefecture leads to greater public secured AI procurement in a subsequent quarter? Okay, that's the question we're after. We can do a simple different diff, or I would call the OOS specification, which is a panel specification, which is essentially controlling for location and time fixed effects. And we can see whether or not the occurrence of political unrest is associated with increased AI investment by the public security arms. Okay. I'm also going to present you an instrument variable strategy, which is obviously sort of having unrest in a region is going to be endogenous to many things that happen in local economic and social conditions. So I'm going to use a strategy that several others in the literature have used, which is using local weather condition to instrument for the occurrence of unrest. The intuition is that conditioning on there being local grievances, whether this particular city alongside with other cities have unrest occurred, depends on how tolerable the weather is for outdoor gatherings. Now, this particular instrument has been used by others in the literature, but there's quite a lot of challenges from a econometric perspective to implement here. One of the big challenges is that a classic paper in this flavor will be on July 4th. There's parade in the US, and you can use weather condition on the July 4th to predict whether there is actually a parade across US counties. Now, that's get rid of the extensive margin variation, because we know either July 1st there's going to be some pattern or not. Now, vast majority of the days over the last 10 years in China, there's no local political grievances. So a lot of weather conditions is not going to be uniformly predictive of protest occurrence when there are protests occur sort of grievances versus not. We're going to be able to deal with the extensive margin. The second is that China is a large country, so weather condition that's favorable in one region is not necessarily going to capture favorable weather condition in the very different parts of the country. So we need to be very flexible in thinking about the optimal combinations of weather conditions in this environment. And it's going to also have the econometric sort of challenges where the instrument is going to be at the day level, and our second stage specification is going to be at the quarter level. So you're going to have different aggregation of daily first stage versus a quarterly second stage, which is going to mess up the standard error calculation, which will be the case. Okay, so I'm not going to bore you with the econometrics, but I'm happy to discuss more about how we resolve that. But so I'm going to show you the baseline version, which is take 30 different weather conditions and use the lasso to flexibly and tie our hands in using to predict which is the most favorable weather conditions for each of the cities over time. But our results is very similar if we use different sort of IV strategies. Okay, so this is our baseline result. The way to read this is that panel A is sort of the top panel is showing you the OOS version, which is different. Okay, not actually on sort of local public security arms the government's procurement of AI. Panel A2 is using the lasso IV version, using weather to instrument whether unrest happens, and then using the instrumented predicted unrest to look at sort of whether that instrumented sort of favorable weather induced unrest is leading the government to buy more AI. Okay. The latter two panel is showing a equivalent version, but not only looking at AI, but looking at AI combined with the government's purchases of high resolution cameras. You can think of this as not only buying AI, but also buying complementary technology that will make the AI more useful. Okay, so throughout you see sort of a pretty strong patterns of a possible ownership, which again, if you focus on the IV version, I will claim this to be causal, which is when unrest happen in a local region, very quickly within a quarter or two, the local government starts to procure, and the local public security arm of the government starts to buy more AI services. And the buy AI services and also in many cases combine that with more purchases of the surveillance cameras.
So how big is 0.199? How big your different diff?
Yeah.
So is that big or small?
So embarrassingly, I don't remember what's the mean. I did remember the discussion that this is not a trivial effect at all. But that's easy for me to find from the paper exactly what is the percentage increase of that. So take my words, it's not trivial, right? But I don't know the number.
It would be helpful to show some raw plots. Do you have any raw plots?
So what happens?
This is examples of the prefectures where you have several time series.
Yes, I might not have linked it to here. In our appendix, we have sort of essentially the cross-sectional scatter plots of where the unrest happened and where the procurement are taking place. And we can do this sort of over time, and you see pretty strong pattern of this function. I mean, it's easy to do this in a different depth than in the IP.
Right.
What's the source of the endogeneity?
A big source of endogeneity is that if local government or local economic condition is dying because they're firing a lot of people because of closing down the factories, that leads to people to go to the street, to go on strikes and so on. That could lead to local government being under very different sort of physical conditions and economic conditions to restructure their procurement planning or the budgetary planning, and that might change how they procure different things. So if there's a common shock of economic condition that drive protests, and then the economic shock also drive how governments think about procurement, then this will be one version of endogenous. Okay,
So this isn't drought causing farmers to come out and protest.
so most of these protests are
I understand.
Yeah, so most of these protests are in the
Our
domain
farmers
of
don't protest.
no, not at least not
That's
necessarily.
not what you're getting at.
Yeah, most of the protests you think
I
of
mean,
as
what
labor
you-
strikes.
It sounded to me like what you're saying is, if there's a bad day,
Yeah.
they don't come out. Right? I mean, that's what it's not that the sun is out and bright and clear, it's gonna create.
Yeah, if they're hail, if they're like
Right.
it's extremely cold,
Right,
the on that day when there are, in the places where there's similar sort of labor tensions, those cities has sort of strikes, but not that one city that just happened to have a major sort of weather strike. I'm sorry, weather disaster. Okay. I will show you now a couple of sort of additional evidence to suggest that there seems to be a more general upgraded technology in this time frame. First one, I already showed you earlier that as the government is buying more AI, they're also occasionally buying more high resolution surveillance camera because you sort of need to have some. If the government doesn't have the hardware yet, it's useful to have high resolution cameras, video streams, so to feed into AI. A lot of the AI products that local governments are buying from, or the very first product that they developed after the signed local contracts had very explicit surveillance components, and that's probably the contract or the kind of product that governments are actually demanding or purchasing, which is explicitly about sort of public security surveillance flavor. The third one, which is I find is particularly interesting from this broader upgrading perspective, is that we can also look at sort of the hiring of police at the local police station over time. We find that those governments who buys more AI are significantly less likely to, or not less likely, but they were hiring less new police forces into the local police department. This potentially is mechanical because if there's a fixed budget, I spend the budget on AI, I might have less budget left over to human capital. Okay. But second is that conditionally on the new police that's been hired, there's a substantially larger share of the new police forces that require higher education for desktops, explicitly for desktops, than sort of the high school police forces that might be holding batons and sit on the streets. So that's when you think about labor as another component technology in this flavor, that there's some sort of complementarity of upgrading the labor forces in a police department as well to potentially be tailored for the AI. This is not to say that AI is the model or the most important technology. Certainly, I think police forces oftentimes is still the model technology there, but on the margin there's some upgrading across the entire sort of police population. Or any other questions on this? Okay, so this is just saying that when protests happen, local government buys AI. That doesn't necessarily mean that AI is actually helpful. There are many reasons to think that AI is still fairly early stage, is not going to be particularly helpful to actually deter protests or making protests less likely to happen. We're going to test that in next. Do AI procurement suppress subsequent unrest? Now, this is going to be a hard sort of question to answer because I just put AI purchases on the left-hand side of the regression and protests on the right-hand side of the regression. Now I need to flip it, and everything I talk about endogeneity is going to come by this in this flavor. And also, there's going to be a lot of autocorrelation in protests. That places that has protests going to have a stream of protests, which is going to make sort of this inference a lot harder. Okay. So our approach is you can think about this as an intuition of that is going to be somewhat similar to a shift share Arctic style instrument, which is the flavor of any contemporaneous shock that make a protest easier to happen. Take the example of our good weather conditions in a day where there are political grievances. Local populations are potentially responsive to those positive shocks to go to the street to protest. Now the question, and that's essentially the first stage of our instrument I just showed you. The question we're asking is that, does the accumulated purchase of AI make the local population less responsive to those positive shocks? Is the elasticity of protest to good weather starts to taper as the accumulation of AI in the local police departments increases over time? So that's going to be the baseline specification. We're going to have a bunch of sort of placebo to strengthen this. Now, our baseline result is shown in this particular table. I want you to focus on the first 4 columns here. So the favorable weather condition is very possibly associated with unrest events in the contemporaneous period. Again, everything here is at quarter level. This is not surprising because that's essentially our first stage in the previous question that I used good weather to predict unrest. Right? But if you focus your attention on the interaction term, the favorable weather interacted with cumulative AI purchases by the local police department up until that quarter. So not counting that quarter, but up until the quarter before, you see a significantly statistically significant and negative coefficient, which is that positive elasticity of good weather associated with more protests starts to get tapered when there's more AI being procured by that. Right? As a placebo check, which is column 5 to 8. This relationship is not there if the AI is not bought by the local police department. If local hospital or local sort of other public agency or arms of the government that's not really directed to public security is accumulating more AI in the same period, we still see, as you expect, a positive relationship between good weather and unrest, but there's no more tapering of those non-public security AI in the contemporaneous protests. So it's very specific to public security purchase of AI, making the future protests likely happen, but that's not happening in other government. You can think about government broadly speaking, if they're buying more AI, they might change the post-way program, but that seems to be not the case. It's all public security.
David?
Yes.
Have you tried, another question from me. Have you tried interaction of wave 1 funding and weather?
The government funding, yes, that's something on our to-do list. We have not tried at all. So one thing that we did a very different flavor of the specification that gets at roughly the same question. So same issue is that this is looking at within the locality. Is there a change in elasticity of protest in responding to AI? We can also look at as protests tend to spread around a geographic range. Does the spreading of the unrest start to stop in the places where there's accumulation of AI? Now we do see that protests tend to spread in the radius of the city, but it stopped in the cities where the AI purchases are particularly high.
So you aren't worried that it's richer, who has more longer run protests, poorer areas or richer areas? This is really richer areas. They may go buy this AI security, but they can also be paying off, they don't have a limited budget. So they go out and they pay off these guys,
right.
And so that the protests go down.
Right.
And it has nothing to do with the security.
Yeah. So that's a bit related to the Hongbin's question
Right,
about sort
exactly.
of the whole apparatus of one way,
I see.
when it's. So that's something I actually have to show you. That if you think about if a protest happened in one prefecture that leads to a combination of policy responses to make sure that future protests can happen, spending money doing transfers to the population that grievances will be one strategy. Putting more technology there will be another strategy. Okay, so one way for us to get at this is that we can do the same exercise of good weather predicting protests. But instead of using the past accumulation of AI, but using that just whether there was past protests, that will be our aggregate sort of combination of everything that would have happened if the protest happened. That doesn't show a interaction. So it's not, at least this suggests that it's not about sort of you suddenly start to do things that differently after arrest. There might be sort of things that put in place already. This is not to say that one-way spending and transfer is not relevant, just that it doesn't have this discrete jump. But this free jump seems to have happened in flavor of a very quick responses in technology acquisition and purchases. Yeah.
So on this, do you have any information
so that you can control, for example, you have a protest.
Yeah.
One, do you control for the size of the protest? And two, more importantly, particularly given that this is face recognition, like the role, do we know that after the first protest, that they're able now to identify the protesters, and they've cracked down harder, and they've arrested more people, and that then would contribute to the decrease in future protests?
Right. That's a good question. So if I put your question in a more general form, effectively, we don't have much direct evidence on what. I show you AI is useful. I don't have much to say about what about AI that's actually useful. I mean, one version of what you described is it could simply be deterrence, that cameras look sort of fancier, that makes people just maybe slightly quieter on the streets. It could be very effective and successful targeted arrests that not only deter but also literally make the future organizers of protests are not no longer in the. So we don't have. So we collected the information on all the arrests in the prefecture. We see sort of an increase in the arrests, but that's going to be the reason why I didn't put it here is because it's slightly harder to interpret. Part of it is that because I show you that there's also less protests happening. It's already at the baseline. There's probably fewer people to be arrested if you're just arresting people on the streets. So then we end up sort of not having, so we see arrest rises, but we don't know what's the baseline of how many people would have get arrested had there been a similar rate of protest occurrence. Because if everyone stayed at home, then who are the people who are arresting, or they might preemptively arresting people before. But we see a pretty strong correlation between the procurement of AI and in the subsequent period a rise. This is at a yearly level, a rise in local arrests.
When I see I'm lecturing in China and I see a security camera in my classroom, like speak less. I know they're not going to arrest me, I don't think.
Might be easier to spot. Did I see another question? Okay.
Another from me.
Yeah.
There may be different types of AI, such as in tracking the phone, WeChat messages, like those used in Shanghai lockdown.
Right. So that's it's a bit related to Yicheng's question earlier. Everything here is facial recognition. We could certainly in the future start to expand this to a much more broad AI sector. I don't have anything direct to say about non-facial recognition AI applications. Okay, so just to recap a little bit, everything I showed you so far is on the political side of the insurance relationship. That is, there's a politically motivated demand for AI, and those more AI helps politically. I don't know exactly how what's the mechanism of being effective. It could be deterrence, it could be direct targeted arrest, but regardless, it seems to make the local political environment quieter. Okay, so the political side, it's a technology, it's a frontier technology that helps the regime remain stable, at least at the local level. Now, the next sort of part I'm trying to sort of look at is now what on the economic side? When local governments buys more public security AI in a politically motivated way, does that generate innovation? Does it generate innovation not only in the government sector, but also crowding into the commercial sector? Again, sort of you should think about in the baseline that there are many reasons to think about crowding out of commercial innovation. Because I just get a big government contract, I secure the contract, I apparently want to do well on that contract, I want to mobilize all the resources to just produce things for the government, and that might sacrifice on the commercial innovation, which is a typical worry that people have about sort of this kind of government-led inducement of innovation that might pivot sort of innovation away from commercial. But for a healthy development of a sector, you need the commercial sector to have vibrancy as well. Okay, so the first thing I want to show you is an overall effect of what's the effect of receiving the politically motivated public security contracts on AI firms' innovation. So I'm going to define politically motivated public security contracts as the local public security arms of the government's purchase of AI, if that purchase is immediately sort of preceded by a occurrence of local unrest. Okay, so if local governments buying AI all the time potentially, but if I don't see it in the previous quarter, there was a large outbreak of unrest, I'm going to say those are more neutral potentially AI purchases. But if you're buying AI right after a occurrence of unrest, I'm going to call those politically motivated AI, which you might think about distortion factors might be even larger. our baseline specification is going to be a fairly standard event study where we're going to compare cumulative software releases of those firms right before and right after those firms receive this very first government procurement contract. Okay, so this is going to control for firm and time fixed effects, which means that the timing variant selection of firms, government is selecting the biggest and most successful firms to get this contract. So it certainly look very different from a firm who never, among the 8,000 firms, about 15% firms who have at least one contract, so which means 85% of the firms have never worked with firm before. And those 18% of the firms are AI firms are much larger, which is probably sort of the selection of the firm. So we're going to difference out all the timing variant firm selection by looking at sort of, if the firms are just sort of differentially producing more right before and right after the first contract. Right, we're going to again do this at the quarterly level, but timing here sort of really doesn't matter. We can do monthly, we can do Simon year. We're also going to difference out the time fixed effects, quarter time fixed effects, which means that we're going to exploit that firm A and firm B's first contracts comes at different times. So we can take out sort of the general AI development trajectory facing the entire economy and just compare sort of the first quarter relative to each individual firm's specific first quarter into the contract. Okay, I'm going to show you a bunch of regression coefficients on the timing coefficient. Again, this is going to be non-parametrically estimated at the quarter relative to leading up to and after the first contract. So I'm first going to show you all software releases. So this is just every single new piece of software, major upgrade. That's actually, this is very robust if we just drop upgrades, just doing major software releases, but on all softwares. For the firm leading up to the first part of the first contract and after. Okay. So the broad takeaway here is that leading up to the firm's very first contract, there doesn't seem to be an overt pattern of differential trend of these firms compared to their peers in the sector. But very quickly after the first quarter, when the first contract arrives, these AI firms start to produce more software. Okay, so the speed of new software production is very rapid, and I think a lot of this comes from so government software. It could be that they're tailoring and they're customizing software for the government and releasing this to the public. And software that's already have infrastructure and then need new data to come in to tinker the fine-tune the algorithm. And once the algorithm is fine-tuned, which can happen very quickly as data comes in, they push out the software. Now I'm gonna.
And those are software that are registered with the Ministry of Information.
Yeah, these are the software that's registered. Okay. Next, I'm going to differentiate whether the software is intended for government use or for commercial use. Okay. You see a very similar pattern. On the government side, there's an increase right after the first contract. This is probably not surprising because this probably are the contract of the software that governments are buying from, or at least anticipating future government demands and they're pushing out more software. But almost simultaneously, you see these firms, our AI firms are producing after they win the very first government contract, again, a very large inflow of potential future businesses. They're start to increase their commercial innovation. And this is actually very rare, at least in economic literature, that you see crowding in at this speed. Okay, you think about the generic crowding of sort of Boeing after they get a contract with NASA, start to produce more on the civilian sort of airspace. That takes a decade for the crowding of the commercial sector to kick in. The many also evidence that we have about actually crowd out of the commercial activity as you work with the government. And it's very rare you see this pretty persistent and very rapid crowding on the commercial sector, which suggests to us that it's a very immediate input for example, data that the firm has received that immediately allows them to push out things, not only on the government sector, but simultaneously on the commercial sector.
And do we know that you're calling this frontier innovations, but did they just change the name of the software and throw it out there and just, I mean, my contract says you're going to produce me a new piece of software, and I just take an old piece of software and change the name or tinker with it. Right. Can we know?
So there are a couple of things we'll try. One is that we can look at software description and see it has to be sufficiently different from each other to count as one. So if we did that, it doesn't quite change. The other thing I'm going to show you in a second is that as you win your first contract, does it make the firm to become the first-time exporter? So that you really has produced something that you didn't have that allow you to export, and now you have a sufficient good software that other countries are buying. So I'm going to show you that.
So I have an alternative story to this. Remember, Clive Mountain was an entrepreneur here and who has a firm in China. What he told me is that you may have B2B, B2C, B2VC, but right now what's very prevalent in China is business to government. Essentially, the sole goal of my business is to I can secure a government contract to save my ass.
Yeah.
And what they literally looking at this trend, it gives me a feeling that this firm is going to the toilet, and then I secure some relationship with the government official, and then what he told me that usually give a cut to the government official using White maybe 10% of the share, and using his mother's name, and then they start to give you a bunch of money, sustain the business for a couple of years, and then you start to produce. But there's input, but not necessarily technology, or data input or technological input. It's simply. So I guess my question is whether this commercial software is economically viable when they have this additional either capital or data input.
Right. So I see two parts of your question. The first part is that the very first contract that comes into the firm might establish important government ties. You might signal to the market that this firm has won a government contract and they're the good players in the market, and that generates all the signaling to the market. And the second part of the question is that the second part is actually easier to answer, which is what is the commercial market for this product? So on average, the revenue generated by the government sector in all the AI firms is about 1/3 of the revenue, which means that 2/3 of the revenue streams that the AI firms are reporting actually come from the business buyer. So I wouldn't say that this is a market that's completely dominated by the B2G market. To answer your first question, the reason why we're focused on the first contract is that the timing of your second contract comes is going to be very endogenous to how well you perform on the first contract. So it's less clean from an identification perspective, but we can look at that as some sort of useful check to think if everything here is driven by the very first contract signal the firm to the market that this is a great firm, that a local government is going to work with it, then you would imagine to see a very strong diminishing return when the second contract arrives because the signal has already been established. But then more data might be coming, different data might be coming, so it might still be increasing. So when we look at the second contract effect, we still see a very big increase as a firm output after the first contract. The second thing we can do is that we can look at within the same mother firm, different subdivision of the firm, when they get contracts, the mother firm potentially share the reputation in the market, but the data may not share across subdivision within the firm. And we can look at when one subdivision of the mother firm gets a contract, what happened to the second subdivision of the firm who doesn't necessarily have data sharing, but might share the reputation or access to government relationships. And we see sort of not super strong spillover when the cross subsidiary within the same mother firm. Yes. Okay.
So this is all about face recognition. And I think my question is general for this as well. And that is this whole argument about innovation. Can you tell us more about what is needed? In other words, is the innovation, including for the software, the commercial, is it because once you get the government contract that you have more data, which for facial recognition obviously allows you for innovation?
Yeah.
But here, here, I don't know the specifics, but do these companies that get the contracts, do they actually technically have access to the data?
Yeah.
Or is that data actually prohibited from being used?
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then who actually then controls innovation? So it's the government that gives the firms X amount of the data or gives permission.
Yeah.
And only that then controls the innovation.
Yeah, that's a good question. So a couple of thoughts on this. And unfortunately, that's essentially the question we want to ask in a different paper. So I didn't have the slides here. So the key summary of that from a high level is that this is what I was initially sort of allured to by procurement of the AI services generate these linkages between firms' access to government data to the firm, because these are literally data processing firm. You're selling a data processing, which means that by mechanically the government's collected street camera data has to flow to the firm server. So and I didn't have the slides here, which we actually find that, which this is sort of I think the most direct evidence that data has been flown to the firm, which is the quarter the firm gets its very first government contract, we see that firms start to produce more software that's in the name of data management system, data transmission system, which suggests that the firm are handling large amount of data that previously has not been able to deal with. Now, the second point is that to your, like, what can government say that you cannot use the data for any other stuff that we didn't ask you to use for? This is a very tricky question, because it's okay for firms to say, I process data, I give the data back to you and destroy the raw data. But as long as firms retain the property rights over the algorithm, and if the data is being used to improve the algorithm and the new improved algorithms have more commercial application, you still have the spillover. And even the most restricted environments, such as in GDPR, the government can force the firm to return data, but government cannot force the firm to say you cannot retain algorithms because those are firm property. You can think about the spillover as from an economic perspective, it's going to be similar to think about is the data is being shared versus data generates a new algorithm, an algorithm that's being shared. So that's going to be conceptually, I think, very similar, and we're not going to distinguish that. But this is also posed the question of regulatory-wise, it's going to be very complicated because no firm is going to, it's not even viable to think about how firms should return the algorithm that's they use the data to train on.
Besides the number of updates, can you like also collect some data about like how many users they have, or like how many times it was downloaded, like ranking in the app store and something like that, so that it really, I mean, sometimes like it updates more often because its technology is not like very stable, not secure, so that they constantly patch it.
These are not sort of B2C technology. Most of these are B2B or B2G. These are platforms. It's very rarely you see actually this technology show up in the app store. There's an individual, and you think about this, a platform that allow government to do smart city, allow retail. So this is a very different landscape. But the point we're taking is that it will be amazing if we can have data on revenue or sales. And part of this challenge is that every one of these firms, except for one, are public listed. So they don't report the revenues and sales. But if we do this in 10 years, I think then enough of the AI firm might go public, and we'll never see sales data. The export data will be something that's closer for us to see when we will know actually exactly what's being sold. But that's a different nature of domestic sale.
So what are the examples for commercial softwares that all this AI?
Well, for example, the example I showed you about tracking customers in the virtual space. That will be the most salient example, and other ones will be schools will buy software that allow the teachers, the kindergartens, actually that's one we see, that allows the teachers and parents to track the kids to make sure that they go home safely. So you think about this as public security kind of applications.
Oh, there's a software now where the teacher sits in her office and they're doing home bushi, and if the kid isn't working hard, it comes out and says, little John, work harder on your homework. Yeah. It's amazing.
Oh, I should mention that one of the I forgot one of the most salient applications on the commercial side is facial recognition of supermarket checkout, the payment system, and that actually is a great example that this technology requires extremely high accuracy to make it commercially viable, because you cannot sort of tolerate even 0.1% mistake in matching faces. So that really potentially have a very high return of new data coming in, because the technology and the infrastructure technology is probably already being developed. I think that's one of the reasons why the spillover is so fast, because they already developed everything about technology. They just need the data to come in to make the facial recognition accuracy, which would be close to whatever commercial threshold is to be, and then they push them out right away. And facial, everyone who went to China recently will know that the facial scanning in a supermarket without wallet is one feature that many people will enjoy.
Okay, so here's one question, and you have the next one.
Yes.
Yeah, just to follow up on the data related question. So the improvement of algorithms based on large quantity of data, and these contracts are firms providing services to local level public security bureaus. Do they have even if they have access to these contracts, do they have to centralize the data they receive from different contracts, or do they have distributed computing where they can train the algorithms using different locations?
So yeah, so many of these, I think there are different layers of the question. Many of these firms receive multiple contracts, but these are all like very local level. There are a couple, for example, the Xinjiang government do this contract at the province level, but most of these contracts at the city level. And you know, I don't have a good sort of handle on if I have multiple contracts. This is a very important question to think about the scalability of this. What's the return of scale? What are the firms, to the extent that they're doing very similar things for different government? Are they sort of, are they adding this data together and so on? And what kind of national data access will be probably by default, but some degree of national, for example, if you work with local police department, you have access to the national ID system essentially. So that's going to be national data, but every single firm is going to have that, so it's going to be washed out by Empirical. Now, your second question is that, I mean, this is we'll have nothing to say in the paper, unfortunately, which is, why does every single local government buy this system on their own and work with a gazillion firms? And why isn't Beijing just buy one system for all of the local police department? Now, my current answer is that this is not unusual for all procurement contracts and local fiscal spending that's being conducted at the very local level. Most money are spent at local governments, and public security spending is yet another version of that. But that doesn't justify this. One would imagine that this is big data and AI would be one sector where it allows central government to directly bypass all of the governments to actually generate, get rid of a lot of the incentive misalignment that political economists and political scientists sort of oftentimes talk and worry about. This will be a great opportunity to bypass all of this, but they did not take that as I think it's because the infrastructure and the procurement system run business as usual and didn't take it as an opportunity to restructure the whole arrangements. But this is my speculation. I have nothing directly empirical to say. It could also be equally likely is that we're at the stage where governments are try to weed out winners. And once they figure out which are the two best firms, after a lot of local competition, the national government of Beijing might pick those two firms and then do it unclear.
Yeah, I just curious if there is a way to to quantify the similarity between government and commercial product right after they get a contract. Because there's still the concern that they're essentially the same product, but probably the company slightly changed the description or the application. And so
yeah, so that's my answer to Scott's question earlier, where we use the similarity to essentially. I mean, the question you can imagine there's a lot of degree of freedom. Where do we do the cutoff of the part so similar to be just a simple copycat of another product we have? But we've done some access in that flavor of dropping things that looks description-wise look too similar to don't call that as a new product. But that's I mean, I should also say that this is not to justify sort of our work here. This is a caveat, but this is a caveat sort of many in this literature about product innovation are facing. Like sort of once you're not looking at patent. The nice thing about working with patents is that patent offices explicitly try to screen by differentiation. If you're working at on product innovation, then you have to run into the problem of what is a new product, and that's a problem that we're facing here as well. Okay, so one last thing I want to show you on frontier innovation is that when those when those AI firms gets their first politically motivated public security contracts, is that associated with that firm starts to become a export firm in a subsequent sort of period? We can again do this at the quarter. Okay, and we see this is one I actually know the name, Scott. This is extremely large effect. So on average, only about 1% of the firm are exporting. And then working with having at least one public security contracts in the next quarter, and we can I think this number actually is this is the quarter effects. The next quarter, this is almost a tripling of the effects of the lag model. The firm starts to become a first-time exporter of those products. Again, this is I think the evidence that there are new products being developed that really seems to be at the frontier. That there's a global demand for those products. Yes.
Speak to the qualitative difference, if there is any, between what these private firms are doing in China compared to what some private firms are doing in the US. I don't know if you're familiar with like Clearview AI or Palantir.
Yeah.
So they claim to have, I think, more comprehensive data sets than probably some of the Chinese firms.
Yeah.
And
Clearview is not the most PR-wise reputable firm out there.
so, and I understand in terms of market structures, it's more concentrated, but in terms of, and of course, the Chinese government is a lot less liberal than the US government. So, but just from the firm innovation perspective,
yeah,
why should we assume that the best Chinese facial recognition firm is better than the best US firm? And so like several reasons why that might not be the case. For example, like just in terms of facial recognition, the US is actually more ethnically diverse. Like the Chinese algorithm might work perfectly on the Uyghurs and Han people, but not the rest of the world, right? Or like there's diminishing returns to more data. So at some point, it will tell us that just having more data is not
yes.
So I was just wondering if you see any qualitative difference.
Yeah. Well, this is a great sort of leeway of the last section. In fact, hopefully I will show you something not just qualitative but also quantitative that precisely is as you articulate very well. It need not be that these Chinese firms are at the frontier. It could be that they're domestically at the frontier, but they're not internationally at the frontier. And US might have a wider market, and Chinese sort of firms might be doing something that's very narrowly about political AI applications and so on. So that's precisely why we want to look at sort of the exports to see, is China actually exporting more about AI products compared to the US counterparts or any other sort of frontier technology export. And also importantly, do we see a different, we know that US and Europe are exporting a lot more of frontier technology than China. Do we see a flip of that, for example, in the AI sector? Do we see a politically biased importers of technology compared to people who buy actual vehicles and other sectors? This is exactly where I'm getting to now. Okay. So what's the international ramification of this? I'm going to show you two sets of questions and results. First one is that what I alluded to earlier, but we have nothing concrete to say, is that if there's such relationship exists, that sort of look, AI firm work with the Chinese government, get more data, produce more software, and at the aggregate that suggests that it could exist a competitive advantage of countries such as China in developing more of such technology. Okay. Whether that competitive advantage actually do exist, the trade economists has tell us for 40 years how to test competitive advantage, which is essentially look at which country export more and differentially export more to other frontier exports. So that's exactly what I'm going to do first. Now, I want to focus on the graph here. The way to this is, sorry, it might be a bit too small, but the two maps is showing on the top panel all the trade linkages and exports of AI products exported from China to different parts of the world. And on the bottom panel here is all the exports coming out of the US to different parts of the world. And the thickness of the arrow is showing you the amount of trade deals that's going to that one country. Okay. So here you see that China is exporting to 85 countries versus the US is exporting their AI products to 55 countries. And China has twice as this amount of AI trade deals over the last 5 years compared to the US. This is suggestive of competitive advantages, but not necessarily so. So a stricter test of competitive advantage is that we can compare whether China is more likely to export its product to a particular country relative to the rest of the world and relative to all the other non-AI frontier technology. That is AI is a technology where China is exporting more and exporting differentially more compared to all the other countries' exports. Okay, so the key coefficient here we want to focus on is first that the negative coefficient on AI is relative to all the other frontier technology. AI is still a young sector where there isn't too much global trading going on yet. Okay, so that's probably not surprising. But the interaction of China being exported on AI is significantly and quite substantially positive, which means that compared to all their technology, compared to all the rest of the world, China is substantially exporting more AI to other countries than either you compare with the rest of the world or compare directly to the US. One other sharper thing, which this figure I like a lot, which is we can also do this technology by technology. Essentially saying that what is the premium of China compared to the rest of the world in AI exports compared to, I think, 15 other frontier technologies that's been categorized. AI first has the strongest China exporting sort of, you can call it bias or additional exporting, sort of very much stand out compared to all the other frontier technology. But also compared among all the other frontier technology, the two that actually have a pretty substantial China sort of premium exporting are in a sector where associated with China's competitive advantage, such as radioactive materials, sort of the minerals and steam turbines, which is the clean energy sector, where China has some marginal competitive advantage in its industrial policy and so on. But AI really dwarfed the other frontier tech in terms of how much China is exporting. Okay. So this is showing that China has competitive advantage in this technology and relative to the US and relative to others. Yeah.
I kind of want to ask a little bit about AI and facial recognition AI in particular, because I guess at least in Silicon Valley, when people talk about innovation, innovative capacity, there's a lot of stuff about institutional systems and all these different factors that go beyond just factors that go into the production of that innovative technology. So can I also deduce from what you're saying that there's something about facial recognition AI that's about the data and less about the institutional factors that lead to this kind of leapfrogging or this kind of finessing of the technology. And that's why China has this kind of advantage in terms of being able to come up with good facial recognition AI. It's about the quantity of data instead of other stuff.
So I would say there are two. Data is one. The not necessarily abundance of data, but the ability for the private firm to access those data through the procurement. I think that's feature number one. That's important. Feature number two, which is at the background of all this, is that there's additional public sector demand for this technology that generates sort of injection of funds, injection of data. The sort of the countries of China might want to put AI cameras on all the streets, but that's explicitly banned in Boston, for example, in SF in the public space. So there's going to be lesser demand of the same technology for that reason. Yeah, I think that's my answer to the question.
So my bet, it's just that the market is our customers are other democracy countries that all ban that, but China sells to all the other autocracies, so they have a comparative advantage.
This is exactly where we're going next.
Okay.
So what potentially would, from a political perspective, might be problematic is we can ask, is there political biases in China's exports? Because if you think about this as a home market effect, China developed technology that might be favoring to autocracy or useful autocracy. Other technology might even they're not at the frontier, they can start to import China's technology and start to benefit from this technology. Now, bear in mind that autocracy is associated with lower income and was associated with just lesser imports of foreign technology to begin with. You would expect to see democracy in general to buy any other foreign technology just because richer country buys more of the technology. Okay, so the question again, we're going to look at this. I want you to focus on the figure first. The same figure as before, China's exports to the rest of the world, US exports to the rest of the world, but now the color is indicating whether the importing country is a autocracy or weak democracy. So in the process score, there's going to be any country with process score below 4, or the strong or mature democracy, any country with process score above 5, and the cutoff is really not that important. Versus the US country. Okay, so here you see that US is exporting about 70% of technology to strong democracy or the sort of mature democracy. Again, these are richer countries who just buy more technology to begin with. And 30% of those exports is to weak democracies and autocracies. Where China is about 50-50 splits, that there's essentially relatively higher share of AI being imported from China to autocracies than mature democracies. And this too by itself doesn't explicitly show the bias, and the regression form is going to show that directly. We can compare China's AI export to other countries, China's export of frontier technology to other countries, whether that buyer is more likely to be in countries with low policy score, with democracies or autocracies, relative to all the other frontier technology that China is exporting. Okay, so and we can also benchmark this with the US. Now we see a very strong policy coefficient between the destination country or importing country being a low policy score country, and which means that AI sector they're disproportionately more imported from autocracy. Now this is sharper than ex ante I would expect. I did this. We can do this again, sector by sector, to see is there a autocratic biases in importing country for all the 15 frontier technology and AI. AI is the only sector in all the frontier technology where in the importing side, there's a substantial autocratic and democracy biases compared to the rest of the technology. Okay? And some suggestive evidence we have is suggesting that as intuitive as you mentioned, the countries that doesn't put enough sort of investments into AI, so they're not potentially at the frontier of AI, are buying more from China to get themselves potentially to be use that technology. If you have domestic sort of indigenous innovation, such as Saudi Arabia in the AI space, they're not buying as much from China. And second is that the country who themselves have faced domestic protests in one quarter are substantially more likely in the next quarter to buy AI from everywhere in the world, but disproportionately more from China. Okay, so suggesting there's a competitive advantage in AI, but also competitive advantage that might be politically have political bias implications. Okay, so to conclude, what I show you in this paper is that in two folds. One is that you could observe sustained frontier innovation and entrenched autocrats coexist together. The existing literature in political economy would suggest that this is not going to be a stable equilibrium, that either you're not going to get frontier innovation or you're not going to get a stable autocrat. Autocrat is going to be overthrown by the new technology. Now, in the AI space, there seems to be an alignment where this is technology that benefits the autocrats, and the autocrats demand for technology, generating more data, sharing more data that allow the sector to grow and push the frontier that becomes self-sustaining. Such sort of alignment, if it's strong enough, could get rid of all the autocratic frictions that the literature has documented, such as lack of credible comment or hold up problem by the dictators on certain sort of potential technology and generate actually sort of push in the sector. This is actually what I mentioned in the earlier discussion already. While we're not saying that this is going to be universally true, certainly it's not going to be universally true for all sectors. I just showed you in the end about trade that this is very special to AI. But it also means that I also want you to come away with saying that this is not unprecedented in the sense that there are technology such as aerospace in the Soviet or chemical engineering in Imperial Germany that might have this alignment in different format. The Soviet Union's regime stability draws a lot from the prestige of being able to develop aerospace technology. That's what gets the regime to be stable by sending the first person in the space and so on, and that generates sort of inputs into the technology and push the technology to the frontier, at least temporarily. Okay. Finally, what I show you in the trade part of the paper is that because of this alignment, that means that countries such as China would have a competitive advantage in this frontier technology. And to the extent that these technologies being traded, it could mean that sort of the China's position strengthen the domestic regime, but it also might strengthen the weak democracy and autocrats elsewhere in the world. And in this part, actually, I think this is a slightly different mechanism than what the literature has been mentioning about sort of I think the term the literature uses is called domino effects, where one country falls, the other country fall away from democracy as well. This is saying that some of these domino effects might come through technology transfer and technology exports rather than ideological and others with political sort of spillover, which will be potentially a tractable but potentially worrisome trend where frontier technology and political regimes are interacting in the future. Right. Let me end here and thank you so much for your attention.
Go back to the first page of your slide and ask you this beginning question. There's a book called 1001 interventions or inventions that change the world. So China's like 30-some inventions, really innovative inventions, all occurred before 1500. And after that, there was one, there was none. So what happened? So China's regime basically stayed the same. But why there's innovation before?
Yeah, I mean,
what happened after?
That's a gigantic question. And I will say that first, I will not have a direct answer to your question. I think people have written books about this, and I certainly this will not be able to answer that. The two things, and maybe to just build on top of what I discussed, is that there's a certainly sort of, I think, not a paper that tries to defend Jim Robinson and Daron Nasimov's view that you always only see frontier innovation in strong democracy. As you said, many of the frontier innovation happened even before democracy was even a thing. And certainly there's going to be different political dynamics on the innovation sector. Your second question about the Needleman question essentially is what happened to China during the 400 years in between. I have nothing to say. All I can say is like now might be chapter might be turned.
Number 34 just came out. G, and then teaching.
So this is fabulous talk. But the concern I have is you're talking about innovation, and if we move beyond AI and talk about innovation from frontier innovation. In that case, because it seems in your whole model, it's premised on the idea that you've got that the government is the actor that is basically pointing firms and directing innovation.
Yeah.
So that means that in terms of innovation, it could be that nobody's thought about it yet, and some entrepreneurs out there doing something. So that could really suffer because that group of actors is one, not getting funding, and two, it's sort of not within the purview of government. They don't know about it, or they thought about it, or if it's something that the government doesn't actually want.
Yeah.
That is going to be stifled, right?
Yes. Yeah. No, that's a great question. So my two thoughts on that one is, this is why we think that sort of the crowding into commercial sector is important, because you can think about many distortionary forces that when the public sector has a huge demand, the direction of innovation will pivot away from whatever optimal you can define. The fact that when governments send out those contracts to buy facial recognition AI in a local police department, they probably don't care about you using this for facial recognition supermarket checkout rules. Just because the data is being shared across multiple purposes, that at least on the margin limited those distortionary forces. Because as long as the data can be used, but the second part of this is that this is coming back to I forgot maybe Yi-Ching's question earlier. Everything here is within facial recognition. The facial data is what's being abundantly supplied, which means that relative to facial data, the medical data or many other applications of AI might have relatively lesser supplied. So there still could be directional distortions within the AI, or sort of whatever the other sector that's not AI. I don't even know what that is, but sort of that might be crowding out. So those are very important things where we have nothing to say here, but we're looking to sort of know. It's because the classic example is that China is a bit behind on the medical AI compared to the facial recognition AI compared to the United States. And part of that is relative to the medical data that US firms get access to the hospitals, the facial data is just much more abundant. That can generate distortions at a higher level, but we don't have anything directly to say about that yet.
Yi-Ching.
There are 2 points. Well, first one is easier. But on the China test comparative auditing facial recognition, I think the last few slides you show sort of it is a little bit contradictory, right? So you don't need China to be in the technology frontier to be able to export to those countries, because if US has certain regulations or reputational costs on those firms not to export to autocracies, you also see the same phenomenon.
Yeah.
I think a more difficult question. First of all, I completely agree with your. I buy your story. I believe in your story. But just that whether the evidence presented in this paper is so closely connected to the story you want to tell, which is about. Whether this is really about supplying data to make innovation possible, to sustain innovation and autocracy, because Alibaba has facial data for everybody. If you use Alipay, you have to use your face, right? So if data is so important for China to be on the technology frontier, you would imagine the technology development happens in big companies like Alibaba. So there are maybe 2 exceptions. One is you think talents are more dispersely distributed, maybe not captured by firms like Alibaba or Tencent, and when they get access to more data and maybe they can overcome the hurdle of a fixed cost because of this government contract, maybe those talents can be used to innovate. That's one potential story. Another is more like a distributed story, which is there's really not much innovation going on, real innovation going on with these 8,000 firms. Maybe for the top 10 firms, there are real innovations, and they get listed and they publish, they do really advanced development. But for the rest 7,000, they're just cutting them, dividing the pie. There's some grant to be extracted. And then, of course, those technologies, although may not be on the frontier, they're useful to control, to exert social control, which I totally buy. So
so these are great questions. A couple of thoughts on that. The first one, essentially, is sort of the exporting effects. I'm sort of referring to our preferred interpretation is that this is the supply side effects, that China is supplying more. It's not that sort of it's not because of the US side supply disproportionately less because of local regulations or PR. That's something that it's hard to empirically, it's completely separate. We're working on that. Our favorite evidence so far is that Google and along with two other companies, which I'm blanking on the name right now, are the proponents to say we're not going to be, we don't want to export our product to autocracies, and and Google is very actively lobbying the US government to say that we want to make sure that our AI products coming from the US don't export it to autocracies. Now, the three companies that are being proponent of this have never exported to, it's not that they have previously exported to autocracy and then decided, okay, at 2017 when the proposal comes, we want to cut those ties. These companies, for whatever reason, have never even engaged so for us, that's saying that it's not all driven by those self-imposed sanctions, because these are sort of self-motivated actors that never export to begin with, and they want to make sure their competitors also don't export. So I don't think that's going to be entirely driving the story here. The second question, which is about essentially actually there are two parts to your second question. Let me answer the most philosophical part, which is here I'm showing you the frontier innovation, which is embodied by firms. You can think about frontier innovation embodied by scientists. Now, you just need one person to write down some, I don't know, equations that gets the Nobel Prize, and you can call that a frontier innovation. You certainly don't need 100 people simultaneously write all 100 different papers to get 100 different Nobel Prize to call that a frontier innovation. So in some sense, the frontier innovation is always pushed by a small number of actors, and then many others who are followed. So here, I don't think this is contradictory or that different from any other sectors where, if you think about the US aerospace technology, it's driven by one firm, it's Boeing, and there's no other, that firm defines the frontier, that firm pushes the frontier. So I think that's very much similar to here as well. Your second point I want to say on that is that a deeply frustrating thing from literature is that a lot of the economic questions about how do you even think about organizing the structure of the firm? Should we give all the data to one firm, or should you get the data equally to 5 different firms so they can equally benefit? This requires you to know the function of what is the return of skills to data. Is that convex, is that concave, or is that plateau at some point? We actually don't, surprisingly, both the economic literature and the artificial intelligence, machine learning literature don't have even a theoretical answer to what that function looks like. And that knowing the shape of the function is crucial to answer the question. But that's something that we would love to work on, but so far we don't even have a theoretical guidance on what the function would look like. Now, the final point I want to make, which is closer to our first paper, is that from setting aside political, everything here, I focus a lot on the political side of this. Setting on the political consideration, our very first paper in this is agenda trying to make the point that from some point, if we think that data is an input into AI sector, and government has historically always accumulated a lot of data, because if you want to collect taxes, you have to know a lot of people, identifiers of individuals. You want to sort of know, government is the one who do geospacing exploration. So the government always been the proprietors of a lot of data. So that's going to be a very similar way to think about government sharing this data to private firm compared to how government is building infrastructure, that building roads and building bridges that will benefit sort of the commercial private sector. So in that sense, data is the raw ingredients and potentially a public goods that government should provide. Now, it has political ramification because it's not politically neutral when government sort of provide this kind of input. That's going to be complicated.
Okay, I want you to do another paper on what is the U.S. implications for the U.S. of all this, right? What should we be doing? But
well, I can't say anything about U.S. The very obvious thing is like the European Union's AI strategy essentially is the GDPR as a privacy regulation essentially coming from privacy perspective, but because the government is not allowed to share any data to the firm, that's going to kill the AI sector for EU for the foreseeable future. So I'm not sure where US is going to head towards, but EU is going the opposite direction compared to.
So even after they read your paper.
They might not have that.
Well, we'll bring it to a close here.